Okay, we're live. So I'm Emily Ritter. I'm an assistant professor at the University of California, Merced, and I'm the coordinator for the online speaker series of the Peace Science Society. So the Peace Science Society has set up a set of colloquia that are online colloquia so that we can share research with one another, get feedback to authors who might need it, and extend the annual Peace Science meeting outside of Mississippi and then Notre Dame as it comes up soon. So I would like to introduce our authors today. So we have Amuitz, Garmendia, Madariago, and Graig Klein, who are both PhD candidates from Binghamton University. And they'll be presenting a paper today on entitled Does Decentralization Alleviate Malcontent? Territorial Distribution of Power and Protest Events. We also have 4 discussants joining us today. We have Chris Sullivan, who's an assistant professor at Louisiana State University. We have Courtenay Conrad, who's an associate professor at the University of California, Merced. We have Nils Metternich, who is a senior lecturer at the University College London. And then we also have, somewhere in the ether, John Reuter, who is an assistant professor at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. We've had a bit of technical difficulty this morning, which is why we've had the late start, and we're still trying to get him in. So hopefully he'll be able to join us as we get going. So the structure we're going to use is that Amuitz and Graig will present their research for about 15 minutes today, and I will let you know when you have 2 minutes left, so that we can, so that anybody who's watching and hasn't read the paper will be able to understand the basics of this research, and then we'll open up the discussion to our discussants. So with that, I'll turn it over to Amuitz and Graig.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and thank you to the discussants for participating in this and helping us with some feedback and moving the project forward. And so, as Emily said, it's Does Decentralization Alleviate Malcontent? So we're looking at how federalism, both at a local and regional level, so kind of municipality and state level, influence the frequency in which we would see protest activity and how we would see collective action against the state. And if we look, well, so the normative approach, what we normally see in a lot of kind of federalism literature, in the kind of more formal models, and the implications that they decide is that decentralization, so giving electoral power to a local or state level, so to elect your kind of local representatives, we should see this as a form of creating a socially desirable governance, or a type of government or political system that individuals would be very happy with. We can think about it in terms of an efficient allocation of responsibilities. Sometimes literature tells us that it actually gets better representation, or we can better represent societal preferences. And most of the literature and how they look at the implications of decentralization really focused on how it affects territorial minorities or territorial conflict. But within this literature too, when we think of what decentralization is, there's lots and lots of deviations. And this creates some kind of problems. So if it's supposed to alleviate some malcontent, if it's supposed to create responsibilities or identify who's responsible, sometimes it becomes very unclear who actually has the responsibility for different kinds of political processes or political decisions. It also can create opportunism. It can create layers of bureaucracy. It can create individual officials who look to take advantage of the new system they've been put in place. And we know there are also some partisan electoral externalities because the people designing the system are the ones who are in power and creating this institution. At the same time, we can think of decentralization as becoming increasingly common. It's a reform that we're seeing spread across the world, both in democracies and autocracies. And yet, while it's spreading, we don't necessarily understand the effect it has on actual political behavior or on individuals' preferences. And there are a number of anecdotes that come from different countries. We list 3 here in the slide. We have others in our paper. One from China takes a look at when taxi drivers go on strike. We actually see that the government, that is very centralized and typically doesn't allow dissent and protest activity, allows a lot of these kind of local complaints because it's a way for them to test the water, see what people feel, what the issues are about. In South Africa, we also see examples of some of this idea of the municipal ineffectiveness. It's service delivery, poor responsiveness of the municipalities. So it deflects some of the anger that protesters may have towards these kind of more localized, geographically proximate governments. And then the last one, we're seeing that in states where corruption is common and politics are unruly, When you give the power to local governments, we actually think that's going to spread some of the vices to other levels. So it doesn't actually create better government necessarily, it actually spreads corruption. It creates more issues that people are dealing with. And so the question we actually have that grows out of this is, does political decentralization influence frequent we see protests, the frequency of these events? If it's supposed to create better governance, then maybe we should see fewer protests. But we actually structure a little different argument that I'm going to get into in the next couple of slides. When we think about protests, we know that they're going to be kind of an early form of discontent or an earlier form of collective action. They're likely to arise before we see kind of full-blown civil war. And most of what decentralization looks at, or the effect of decentralization, is going to actually be on this civil war, this ethnic conflict, a high level of conflict. So we want to bring that down a little bit and think about a more localized level of discontent, something that would be more common across all countries. But we know at the same time that these protest events, or dissent really, the mechanism for dissent is dependent on the political opportunity structures. So some people would argue that mobilization simply occurs where it can, that there's an opportunity to protest, and therefore we see protest. Others start to think about how the institutional design or the institutional context actually creates this opportunity to protest. It's going to spread the opportunity for collective action. We can think about this as it spreads the layers of government that individuals could have problems with. So if we think about this, it's really important to understand how decentralization actually affects protest behavior, the frequency of protest events. If the purpose of decentralization is to create kind of socially desirable governance, we should look at things that are lower levels of conflict than just a civil war or ethnic war, which a lot of the literature looks at. So we want to look at the level of protest activity. And so if we think about this, the effect of decentralization, most of the work, like I said, focuses on this ethnic or secessionist conflict, this kind of high level of conflict, high level of violence. But we know that that creates a selection bias. Not every country is going to have civil war. Some are more prone to them than others. Maybe decentralization is a way to just fend off these conflicts to begin with. And when we look at what the literature finds, it actually produces some mixed results. It's unclear to the extent which the presence or the absence of decentralization institutions actually affect the conditions for protest. Or even in those countries that have a higher level of conflict, there may be some confounding factors that decentralization isn't accurately measuring. So if we think about grievance-based rebellions or civil wars, these are very distinct from discrete individual protest events. And again, to kind of think about this discrete protest events, we're still not looking at social movement campaigns. We're not looking at protest campaigns. We're looking at specific protest events, these discrete independent events that may arise. So when we think about the effect of decentralization, we develop two hypotheses. The first one, this hypothesis one, is that politically decentralized countries actually should have more protest events than non-decentralized ones. And it builds off the idea of political opportunity structures. Decentralization creates more layers of bureaucracy, more layers of accountable governments. It spreads the burden of effective governance to a lower level than just the central regime that may be really hard to protest against, or may be very controlling against dissidents. So decentralization actually places the authority, or the loci of authority, more geographically proximate, so maybe it's easier to organize collective action that way. And it's going to reduce the cost of mobilization because, again, the government is going to be closer. There's more layers, there's more minor things you can protest. The anecdotes about China are a great example. It's very hard in China to organize larger protests against the central government, but we know lots of protests occurred, and the government actually allows a lot of these if they're against local authorities. It's a way of trying to measure how policies are being followed, how policies are liked by these individuals. So there's some idea that if this local governance is allowed, then we actually should see more protest events. There's more to protest against. There's more layers of bureaucracy. And so building on that, we develop a second hypothesis, and that the effect of decentralization is actually going to be conditional on regime type. And so while maybe decentralization increases the frequency of protests in all countries, we actually start to develop the argument that we should actually see a difference between autocracies and democracies. And this average difference in protest frequency between the decentralized and centralized polities should decrease as a country is becoming more democratic. And so this average difference between the two different types of institutions or political systems is going to be more evident among autocratic states, because those that have decentralized have now created these layers of government. They've created additional bureaucracies to protest against. They've made government more proximate. They've put a kind of layer of transparency in between the dictator, and the people. So in an autocracy, when there's a scenario of limited opportunity for political dissent or for public dissent, decentralization actually creates some of these opportunity structures that are going to be necessary to mobilize collective action, to mobilize these protests. And so we think about these in terms of strategic choices. But the strategic choice is going to be very different depending on if it's an autocrat or a democrat. So an autocrat is going to implement decentralization or make the strategic decision on the idea of getting more information from the people. It's a way of measuring discontent in society. It's a way of trying to figure out what policies are acceptable and which are not. A Democrat, while also making a strategic decision, is motivated by a slightly different reason. For them, it's about getting reelected. They want to improve government performance. So within democracies, perhaps we actually do see what decentralization is supposed to accomplish and get a socially desirable government. So building on hypothesis 2, we're basically arguing, we're trying to show that decentralization will increase protests by creating more opportunity in autocracies. And when we get to democracies, we should see this have less of an effect, maybe even no effect, because a lot of these opportunities already exist. Maybe in those cases, decentralization creates the socially desirable government it's intended to create. And so to measure this, we actually use a new set of protest event data. It's the Mass Mobilization Data Project. And so these record protests from around the world with at least 50 different participants. They have to be directed at the government. That means it's people in the country of observation protesting against that country's government. We're not interested in kind of strikes against private companies. We're not interested in protests outside embassies of different countries. So it's specifically against that country. We look at this at a country year level of observation. And for the dependent variable, we look at the number of protests. And we break this into two different ways of measuring it. We look at the overall number of protests, and then we look at the number of protests specifically about political processes or about political behavior, the exact things that decentralization should try to alleviate. This is what the purpose of decentralization is to bring those decisions closer to the public. Our explanatory variable, we take the World Bank's measure of political decentralization indicators. So it basically looks at, are there elections? Is there an elective representation? And we look at the local level, which would be the municipality, or we look at a more regional level, which would be the state. So if we think about this in terms of the United States, the regional decentralization is going to measure if there are elections in New York State, and the local decentralization would take into account any kind of sub-level, sub-entity type of election that occurs. We use different binary measures. We run the models using both of these. And then to test hypothesis 2, we're actually going to interact this measure of decentralization with poly, with the level of democracy that a country has. We have a whole litany of control variables. I'm happy to come back to these. I don't want to spend a ton of time on them. They're not critical to what our argument is. To measure the effect, we use a zero-inflated negative binomial model. And we do this because we can think about zeros being generated from two different processes. We're predicting now both a zero versus having a positive count, and then the effect on the positive count, how frequent these protests occur. When we want to look at this in terms of the inflation stage, we're measuring what might actually impact the difference between no protest and protest occurred. And in some of the results, we get some interesting findings here that are not central to our argument, but are pretty in line with what literature tells us, and explain a lot in terms of how frequent we should see protests. So for our results, we have a coefficient plot here, and we can see that on average, countries that have a local political decentralization, so remember this is going to be like a sub-state level of an elected body, have about 33% more protest events than other countries have, non-decentralized countries. And then when we switch to our second independent variable, as it says on the bottom of the slide there, this number actually increases to about 46% more protests in decentralized than centralized countries. So when it's only about political process or behavior, we are seeing that decentralization creates more protests. And importantly, something that we've tried to deal with in terms of endogeneity in these models is that we're lagging these decentralization and polity measures 1 year. And so instead of trying to think about, well, what if there are a lot of protests and the government's decentralizing because of the amount of protests, we are finding that dissidents are taking advantage of existing political structures. So by looking at what kind of institutions were in place the previous year, we're measuring what protesters can assume their political opportunities are going to look like in the current year. And we're finding a positive and significant effect, both on total amount of protests and on protests specifically against political processes and behavior. And then when we test our interaction effect, we switch to a couple of plots that look at the predicted protest events and depending on the level of democracy. And we find very interestingly, in support of our argument, that local decentralization is going to increase the number of protests actually across most types of political regimes. But this effect is quite dramatic if you look at, I guess it's the left of your screen, if you look at the 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, we look at autocratic states. We see a dramatic difference between those that are decentralized and those that are centralized. And interestingly, the autocratic states that are decentralized have about as many protests as a lot of democracies have. And so if we know democracies are supposed to have more because maybe opportunity exists, we're seeing that in these autocratic states, decentralization is creating similar types of opportunity structures, similar opportunities for protesters to take to the streets. We see a similar effect on the plot on the right when we look at the number of political protests. It's not quite as dramatic in terms of the effect of decentralization in these autocratic states, but we still see a significant difference in autocratic states and autocratic states that decentralize and autocratic states that remain centralized. And so creating these political opportunity structures indeed seems to increase the frequency of protests. Now, importantly, these are not kind of abstract scenarios. These actually occur. And if we look at these autocratic states and how many have local decentralization, we actually see quite a lot of them have some level of localized election. And so when we see this difference, it's not necessarily being driven by 1 or 2 states that might do this. It's across the sample. We see quite a bit of decentralization within autocratic states. And the literature gives us a couple of existing explanations. Again, if we think about China, a lot of it focuses on China and the protest activity there. And that local decentralization is actually a monitoring mechanism. It's a way for the central government to kind of keep tabs on what individuals want, what they're looking for, and how they accept the state-level political decisions.
2 minutes, Greg.
Okay, thank you. Perfect. We also find that these local elections and legislators are actually supposed to divert dissidents away from the central government and towards these localized bureaucracies. So it's a way for these kind of autocrats to maybe proof themselves to collective action, proof themselves to dissent. When we switch to regional decentralization, we're not finding significant results. This might be that there's actually a lower number of regional divisions compared to the localized divisions. And also in terms of institutional design and choice, countries that normally have local decentralization, the opportunity may already exist. So the regional decentralization may not tell us as much, or maybe doesn't create as much of an opportunity. It's not as geographically proximate. It's not as kind of socially proximate as a localized decentralization. So if we think of what we're capturing, we look to a more restricted measure of decentralization. And this is whether a local authority has competencies or has the right to do any kind of policy area. And we use the RAI measure for this, but this gives us mostly democracies to look at because you can see from on the slide, our average level of polity is much higher. And we do observe a reversion point that in democracies that have this regional decentralization, we're actually seeing about 31.5% fewer protests than if they're a centralized democracy or don't have regional decentralization. So perhaps decentralization does create effective policy, or at least regional decentralization might, but we are finding that local decentralization really is driving protest behavior. We see a lot more protests in these local decentralized states. So the takeaways we make from this as we move forward, this is a kind of a first attempt to analyze the general effect of decentralization on social unrest. And like I said earlier, we look at a lower level of collective action or dissent or social unrest than a civil war or ethnic war. And this allows us to actually have a very diverse sample of countries with all kinds of different institutional designs in terms of autocrats, democrats, how democratic these states are. And we're finding a really interesting opposite effect of decentralization in autocracies and democracies. And we think that the effect it has in the autocracies is a really interesting argument. It's a really interesting picture to keep diving into and help us kind of explain institutional design and the effect of institutional design on political behaviors. But of course, we have to keep kind of delving into the ideas of indigeneity issues. We have to keep thinking about what's really motivating which. Is it decentralization is increasing protests, or is it really that protests are increasing states' decisions to decentralize? And with that, I think I've completed my 2 minutes and the 15 minutes overall. So thank you very much, and I look forward to your comments and some of your feedback.
Thanks, Greg. And if you would shut down the screen sharing so we could see your face, that'd be great.
Sure. All right, and we said some spam.
Am I taking that too? Yeah, I know. Okay.
There we go. Okay.
Okay, so I'd like to open up the comments to anyone who would like to get started for us, and welcome John Reuter to our party. So, all right. Courtney, you want to take it?
And then sure.
Nils?
Hi, Greg. Hi, Amuitz.
Hi, how are you?
Good. So I was excited to actually see the presentation, and I'm glad we're doing the presentations as part of this, because some of the theoretical components that showed up in your presentation, I was going to comment that they weren't showing up in the paper. So let me give you guys some examples. So as I was reading through the front half of the paper, both in terms of frame and in terms of theory, I kept wondering, what's the mechanism that you guys are arguing is at play here? So there are lots of them. So is it about changed grievances of individuals? So it could be that people become more aggrieved when they feel like they are not being ignored by just one level of government, but they're being ignored by multiple levels of government. It could be about changed expectations of repression. So maybe people are more willing to mobilize against local government when national government decentralizes, because they see that as liberalization and they think that's an opening that didn't previously exist. Maybe it's neither of those things. Maybe it's about changed expectations of government responsiveness. Maybe they think that local governments are more likely to be responsive to their concerns. Maybe it's about collective action, and you sort of alluded to this, Greg, in your presentation. So maybe it's easier to overcome the collective action problem at the local level than it is at the national level. So each of these strikes me as really different mechanisms that could potentially explain this empirical relationship that you're seeing between decentralization and the frequency of protest. And so I would like to see you guys in future iterations of this paper, develop the theory in such a way that will allow you to generate hypotheses that can help you adjudicate between some of these mechanisms. Just the ones that I just suggested seem to have very different implications in addition to the main hypothesis one that you test.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Thank you.
Nils, and then John.
Thank you very much. So I really enjoyed the paper, and I'm just going to sort of start with one general point about the framing and then sort of just continue on with some theoretical points. So I was wondering whether this is a paper about decentralization and autocracies, actually, because some of the main theoretical points that you were mentioning in the paper and that you also mentioned in the presentation. So, for example, that the regime tries to find out about malcontent or different grievances in different regions by decentralizing and allowing protests in those areas. That seems to be sort of a classical argument of autocracies and how autocracies try to run their countries. And so, and also, when you look at your distribution of decentralization, right, you can see that there's almost no variation in truly democratic regimes. You see most of the variation in these sort of semi-anocracies and autocracies. So I was wondering whether you actually want to sort of push this paper as explaining protest and autocracies and sort of focusing on that.
Okay.
And that sort of goes to the previous comments about identifying which causal mechanisms you actually are caring about. Is in some way, most of your arguments are geared at looking at changes within countries. So basically, you're talking, especially in the empirics, a lot about levels. So, cross-country levels of decentralization sort of explain some sort of variation. But actually, most of your theoretical stories should show me something about changes within countries, right? So given that a country starts decentralizing, if most of your hypotheses are true, then you should see, after decentralization, you should see that increase in protest, right? And so what will be really nice, also then in the empirical part, is to, through random fixed effects or whatever, but basically show that actually when countries start to decentralize, then you get the effects that you're finding, and so not only rely on this cross-country level results, but actually model sort of change between countries. I'll leave it at that for the moment, and I'll have some other comments later.
Thank you.
John?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, Greg. Hi, Amuitz. I'm sorry I missed the first part of your presentation, but I enjoyed reading your paper. And one of the things that really excited me about the paper is I think this has the potential to shed light on two different literatures. One, the protest literature, and then I think maybe more interestingly, the decentralization literature. I think your focus is kind of more on the protest side, but there might be more interesting things to say here. Potentially, that's my opinion about the decentralization literature. And I think a lot of my opening comments here are really just going to echo some of the points made by Courtenay, but I'm going to frame them a bit differently. What I'm going to do is, I don't know if this is criticism or help or what it is, but I'm just going to walk through how I would go about setting up this paper if I were writing it. And it's clearly an empirical paper, that's great, that's fine. And I think when you write an empirical paper, you have two options kind of for how you set it up. One, you can identify an empirical puzzle and then try to explain it. I don't think that's actually the direction you want to go here. The other way you can do it, I think this is more appropriate for this paper, is to identify some debate in the literature. And it doesn't have to be an explicit debate. It might be an implicit debate that you kind of engineer based upon your reading of related literatures. And I think implicitly that's what you want to do here. But I think you really need to dive, even if you don't make this about decentralization, but it's more about protest, you really got to dive much deeper into the literature on federalism and decentralization, because it's almost entirely missing, to be frank here. I mean, the classic sites in that literature just don't show up here. There's no. It's shocking to read a paper about decentralization with no reference to Thibault, right? So in that literature, I think there's at least when I think about it, at least 5 different expectations you could draw about the link between decentralization and protest. One is that decentralization leads to less discontent, which leads to less protest. It leads to less discontent because decentralization produces better outcomes because of, administrative efficiencies, local informational advantage, local competition. So a bunch of Oates and Thibault hypotheses in there. You don't need to take a stand on which of those is correct, but just say, okay, here's one potential hypothesis. Another potential hypothesis is that decentralization increases protest because it brings government closer to people, which increases civic virtue and generalized rates of political participation. That's a Tocquevillian hypothesis, right, about the link. A third possible hypothesis, which I think is really relevant for your work, which Courtenay mentioned, is that decentralization increased protest because it makes collective action easier. So collective action is easier in small groups. This is an Olsonian hypothesis, right? 4, and this isn't addressed at all, but you've really got to dig into the literature, the economics literature on decentralization. The 4th possible mechanism is that decentralization increases protest because it leads to bad outcomes, not good outcomes. Decentralization leads to policy-making failures because local governments are more easily captured by rent-seeking officials and local business cabals, right? So this is Blanchard and Schliefer, and this is one of Treisman's main critiques. 5, and I think this is your argument, which we can talk more about when we talk about theory, that I think needs to be developed a little bit more, which is that decentralization increases protest because there are more kind of points to protest against. There are more access points that you might find grievances with. And so I think, I have more to say about theory and helping you develop that, but I think just in terms of framing it, what you might do is lay out all these things and say, the literature doesn't, empirically we don't know which of these is true, and we're going to take a stab at it. And we slightly favor this last one, this access points one, but let's see what the data say.
Okay.
Thank you.
That's all I have for now.
All right.
Do you guys want to respond to any of this yet, or do we want to take some more? Do you want to respond?
We can do either way. We can respond to some of this. I guess I think I'm speaking for Amuitz here as well, but I'm glad a lot of these points were raised because these are things that we've been kind of working our way through and thinking about in terms of the paper with framing and what is the right approach to it, or what should be the frame. And you know, John, you're definitely right that it's an empirical paper, and we should frame it in terms of there is this puzzle. You know, kind of normatively, we have these assumptions that should occur given decentralization. What should we actually see happen? And as Courtenay was pointing out, I think if we can try to kind of untangle some of these a little bit and try to come up with specific hypotheses that would help explain the direction we're seeing or help explain what we're finding in our results, that certainly would improve this. And I think, Nils, with what you were saying in terms of the regime getting influenced, that's definitely a classical argument, and I think a lot of kind of current pieces are looking at it from that approach in terms of are these autocratic states actually creating information flows for the individuals or for themselves to kind of learn more? And do you have anything to?
Yeah, I thank you very much for all the points, and I really all the points are great, but I really agree with John in this point about how we need to work on the framing of the paper. And on that frame, we really need to tackle the issue of our mechanisms, because right now we have 3 or 4 mechanisms going on, which are actually which could be competing explanations for the same observable empirical outcome. So I think that since we really want to make this an empirical paper, we should work on framing it on in that direction. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And Nils, what you're saying too about the changes within countries, this is something that we've been trying to work on or wrap our heads around of how we're going to do this, because we are encountering a kind of slight empirical problem with this, in that the sample of protest data we have only goes back to 1990, and a vast majority of these countries have already adopted decentralization policies by the time that we get the data. So there's not a ton of variation in terms of how many countries are switching and introducing this policy once our sample begins. There are some, but a lot of them, a lot have instituted, especially the local decentralization, prior to the protest data beginning. So that's something that we're trying to figure out how we can actually measure this with kind of an adequate sample to have confidence in what our results are telling us.
Okay. How about Chris? You got anything?
Yeah. Just kind of working my way through the introduction. The normative hook in the beginning I found really appealing, but then when you go to grapple with the empirical literature, I felt like there was some tension with how you wanted to deal with it, and this is related effectively to all of the previous kind of theoretical conversations about what these institutions are doing in terms of their utility for the regime. So I guess it's kind of literature has kind of shown that these are related to ethnic conflict, and that might be because these institutions are designed to work in multi-ethnic societies. The paper is kind of trying to tone that down or take it down to the level of protest, work backwards from civil war or ethnic conflict to protest. But it's ambivalent about whether the protests are promoting conflict or kind of resolving conflict. And so that matters for the normative debate, right? If it could be true that decentralization resolves conflict by creating more protest. That would be one way of kind of endogenizing the whole relationship. Or it could be the case that, and you can go back and forth throughout the paper about whether these are kind of exogenous effects of long-lasting durable institutions, or these are endogenous choices made by leaders to kind of solve a bunch of problems. And it matters how you hook it, right? So one would, if you think this is endogenous, then you might generate predictions about how protests relate to ethnic conflict. If you think it's exogenous, then you need to make a stronger claim about how regimes make these decisions accidentally, effectively, to produce conflict. I liked Nils' idea of kind of cutting it into just authoritarian regimes. Certainly from the data point of view, that seems like a strong way to go. And also, it reduces the amount of literature, the scope of the literature, and kind of like I think would make for in some ways an easier paper to write. That said, the hook that grabbed me was the idea that federalized autocracies can have more protests than non-federalized semi-democracies, and in some case, near full democracies.
Mm-hmm.
That seems to be a puzzle, right? Like, if that's true, then much of how we think about the structure of political institutions and social protest might be wrong. And this goes all the way back to kind of the origins of political opportunity theory and Charles Tilly, right? And so protests come from the growth of the state and the expansion of the state into local communities. And what that does is pull protest into the capital, right? That's how we create. That's why people become involved with government. And from there, people have for 30 or 40 years been thinking about political opportunity structure at the level of the state instead of kind of at the local level. Mm-hmm. And it might be the case that local governance is more important. But I think you got to solve the first puzzle first, right? It's like, is this good or bad for the government? And then from there, you can tell me something about what's happening locally versus nationally.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of the good or bad from the government. Because maybe they do want more protests because that's a way to kind of release the valve of tension. It gives it gives these dissidents something to do before they actually go to more kind of high-level collective action or armed resistance. And that's something we can try to untangle a little bit. We have to think of how to do that.
It's a theoretical issue almost more than an empirical one.
I've got Nils on a two-finger.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I think was sort of exactly that point was sort of on my list as whether you sort of frame protest as something good or something bad, right? And that very much speaks to then also the empirical model, because I would think, maybe I'm wrong about this, but I would think that in democracies, you want to see, for example, protests. You want to make sure that these are things, and there might be some autocracies for them. It's also a good thing if we believe your story about it's a mechanism for them to gain information. But if you sort of, especially if you throw the democracies and the autocracies into one bunch, like one empirical model, for example, you think that for both of them you have the same data generating mechanism, then I'm not so sure about that, right? Because the mechanisms you're thinking about might be very different in democracy and autocracy, so it's going to be difficult for the model, right, to capture both of these data generating processes, even though you have sort of this interaction there, but still it's going to be sort of very difficult to pick up on these effects.
Courtenay with a two-finger.
I think it's a two-finger.
Wow. Courtney's turn.
So this is related to some of Chris's points, and I think Nils gives some good ideas about, again, why it might be important to sort of look just at autocracies instead of autocracies and democracies. But you don't really bring up the endogeneity concern until you get to your empirical model, and you talk about, when we get to talking about empirics, we can talk about potentially ways to deal with it there. But I think, I don't know if it would be a better fit for this paper or another paper, but I kept wondering whether or not the state expects more protest when they extend decentralization. And so you cite the Huang piece and the Lorenzen piece. And so I think I would focus, if you're interested in this idea that the state might be acting strategically, I would focus a little bit more on those two pieces in particular, because those are pieces in which the state is certainly a strategic actor in the decision to offer decentralization, specifically for the reason that you suggested, Greg, which is, to act as sort of this valve to allow local level dissent so that the dissent is not then targeted at the federal government. And so I'd be interested in seeing you guys talk a little bit theoretically in the paper about how the anticipation of protests affects that decision to decentralize in the first place.
So yeah, we try to, within the paper, we try to somehow deal with that inner contradiction in our argument. That is that if leaders are being strategic, I mean, this the choice of decentralization should have two potential completely different outcomes, and that's very difficult to do from a single paper. So maybe yeah, we completely agree with you in the idea of maybe dividing this into different papers, because we are dealing with completely different structures of incentives right there. So.
Yeah, and we identified that in the presentation in terms of if we're coming from an argument that it is a strategic decision, both types of regimes are acting strategically, but for very different purposes. And as Nils and Chris, and I guess kind of all of you have pointed out, the idea of maybe focusing on autocracies allows us to isolate a mechanism or two, or kind of get more at what the strategic decision would actually look like, or the effect of the strategic decision, rather than kind of conflating all of the results and maybe not getting the same type of answers or the intensity of answers if we split it between autocracies and then maybe look at democracies separately. Especially if we do believe that these are different strategic decision-making processes, or at least what the goal is, or the motivation for these are very different. Maybe that is a way to go, to kind of just to break these apart and focus on non-democracies for now.
And maybe, John, that's the reason why we didn't work enough on the decentralization literature, because I mean, actually, the theoretical framework would be completely different for the two different types of outcomes. But actually, the way you have put it, we're trying to go through different potential explanations and then testing them in the form of hypotheses, different hypotheses. That could be very interesting. Yeah.
John.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Just a two-finger on this point, this discussion about making this paper just about autocracy. I think it is, and I don't know if this is good or bad. It's a very different paper, it seems to me, if it's just about autocracies. And I think you might end up having a difficult time kind of making this strategic argument. I think a lot of the variation, not just in autocracies, but in democracy, a lot of the variation in decentralization is pretty exogenous. It's set by things like the size of the country. I mean, let's make this less abstract. What are the big decentralized autocracies? They're big. They're Russia, they're China, they're Nigeria, they're South Africa before '94, they're Ethiopia, they're Argentina back during the military governments, Brazil, right? So I think. But I think that's good for you. I think it might be easier. It's just for you to just say, listen, levels of decentralization, even in autocracy, a lot of that variation is exogenous. So we're going to start with that and then look at the effect of this on protests. I just think it becomes a big, unmanageable theoretical snarl when everything is endogenous in this.
Yeah, I think that's definitely one way to kind of help with some exogeneity, or to show that it's an exogenous process.
Nils had a follow-up on that.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned that sort of you have data constraints, right, in showing sort of to look at sort of variation before and after, and whether sort of, how that endogeneity might work. So if that's an empirical constraint, what you might want to think about is to take seriously sort of the strategic perspective of the government and think about what does the government actually want from the decentralization. So what is actually sort of their objective by decentralization? So is it sort of stability, or is it not going to war, or is it just a long tenure of the leader? And maybe in sort of, maybe not as a main part of the paper, but maybe as sort of an appendix, if you could show that those countries that decentralize and have more protest attain their long-term goals, right? So stability, long tenure of leaders, and so on, that then you could show, then you can sort of say, well, you know, it's actually sort of the working in the way that I would like this to work.
Mm-hmm.
Did you guys want to respond or take some more comments?
Let's see. Trying to go through things. I do think, I don't know, it really seems like pointing towards the idea of looking at autocracies certainly helps this a little bit. In terms of, I guess, the data limitations, maybe it's a different question, but thinking about the kind of stickiness of these institutions, if we could look at the time since decentralization and look at, in terms of what that looks like on protest activity. I don't know if that would help us get at this or get around some of the kind of data limitations in terms of the temporal period. But maybe if we're looking at the effect, and especially, Nils, as you said, kind of the long-term, maybe strategic outcomes or what these states are looking to do,
mm-hmm.
perhaps looking at time since decentralization, time since this kind of strategic or institutional design or choice was made, may help us get a little leverage on those types of questions.
Yeah. So we've been trying to deal with the idea of endogeneity through like, I mean, for us it makes sense to apply or at least try to design a diff in diff model, but it's very difficult because we have various temporal treatments. So decentralization among the countries that experience a decentralization reform in our sample, decentralization happens in very different times, and it's like the model becomes like a complete monster with like all kind of treatments, temporal treatments. So I mean, if you could we would love to hear from you, like any recommendation in this regard.
So who's up? John. And then Chris.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, can't hear you. Okay.
Have we moved on to empirics? Can I talk
Sure,
about empirics?
if you like. Yeah, go for it.
It sounds like the conversation's moved there. So
I think it has.
So, okay, since we're on the topic of decentralization and autocracies, I think one of your big empirical challenges is that de jure, especially in autocracies, de jure decentralization doesn't equate to de facto decentralization, right? And so even if, let's take the example of Russia, right? So you have, on paper, you have elections, regional elections, local elections, but everybody knows, voters included, who are important for your story, that it's really the central government that's calling the shots, political shots, in terms of who gets appointed and what type of policies are made at the local, at the regional and local level. So, so yeah, I'm not sure what, I think that your measures of decentralization are going to be quite noisy in autocracies. And a related point to that, I think, is that your hypotheses, they assume a certain model of political accountability that's actually up for debate in the comparative literature, which is how do citizens assign blame for local policy failures? And in democracies, this is completely unclear. I mean, there's some evidence that says that people, this is all, most of this work's done in the economic voting literature, that people assign blame to local officials for local policy failures, but there's other literature that says they assign it to national officials, even in federal systems, and then there's other work that says it's total chaos once you have decentralization, no one knows who to blame, so they just stop trying to blame anyone. But then the problem is once you get to autocracies, it's even with where you have weak institutions, it's either even more unclear or, and there's some work now showing this, people end up just blaming the central authorities for everything, even if you have de jure decentralization. Now, I know the case of China seems to disprove everything I said, but I think that's the only case that does that.
Okay, Chris.
Yeah, this is something of a departure, but I think the last comment was really valid on a theoretical level as well as empirical. There's a whole bunch of kind of concepts that kind of interact throughout the paper in kind of inconsistent ways. Federalism and decentralization, local and regional decentralization, legislatures and executives, political and non-political protests, ethnic and non-ethnic protests, mobilization and protest, events and campaigns. There's a kind of they link the theory to the empirical model, and when you get into the empirics, you've clearly stated preference about one of these terms versus another. But I didn't get the idea in reading the theoretical section that there was a kind of coherence to the way you use the language, or an argument about why regional decentralization might be different from local decentralization, or why legislatures are more important than executives, or in political protests, non-political protests. Like, these things just kind of like, they just show up. And I would, yeah, so just good concepts, basically.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Courtney, sorry, I muted instead of unmuted.
So, do the mass mobilization data allow you guys to distinguish between whether the protests are happening at the local or the national level, or both?
They do. That's something that we've been kind of playing with a little bit in trying to separate these. The variable that would allow us to do this is not a numeric value. It's all like a string variable that we'd have to go in and look through and identify. And we've been doing that and trying to get at that a little bit. As somebody who did a lot of the coding, most of the protests are either at a national level or they're about localized issues. So I think if we could get through and actually look at this, I think I'm imagining from where your question might lead, kind of getting at the location of these protests could really reinforce some of our arguments.
Yeah, so what I was going to say was, if you can distinguish between the two, and it's interesting that you said most of them are national level protests anyway, so I was thinking it would be interesting to know whether or not the decentralization mechanism was leading to protests just at the local level, right, or at the national level as well, right? Perhaps because, you can imagine a coordination story where once people can coordinate better locally, they're better able to overcome collective action problems that allow them to coordinate against the national government. And so it would be interesting to sort of be able to just think about a little bit about where the protests are happening, because very different theoretical stories, I think, would lead to an increase in protests at the local level versus an increase in protests at the national level.
Yeah, I agree. And I think with what a number of you have been pointing out, kind of figuring out which mechanism we're really going after, or what the story is, if we can start to kind of distinguish where these protests are, or at least kind of the level of government that they're targeting, that helps us get at some of these different mechanisms, maybe allows us to develop hypotheses that would specifically look at certain parts of this.
Chris.
I was really, where did the data come from was a big thing for me. And I got onto the website and it wasn't clear there. If I had to take a guess, they're automated codes off of news wires, but I have no idea. But if they are news sources, this is relevant for Courtney's comment, right? Because the newspapers are going to pick up are going to be protests in the Capitol. And so, it might be the case that there are more protests in the Capitol as a result of these things, but that doesn't mean there's not local protests that just aren't picked up in the newspapers.
Mm-hmm. They are coming from news sources. And that's what I think I said this in the presentation, but at some point we don't get a whole lot into the data in this, because there is a paper that's R&R that really gets into the data and explains questions like that, Chris. And from somebody who is working on the data collection and the coding and all that, there are protests at the local level. There's definitely plenty of protests that are reported occurring in kind of the equivalent of middle of nowhere. So there may be an overrepresentation in the capital given the sourcing for it, but we certainly are still picking up on kind of localized dissent and very local protest activity. So it's a concern, but again, we're working with the data that's available that allows us like kind of disaggregate to individual events and not focus on kind of protest campaigns.
Just a two-finger. Am I muted?
You're good. We can hear you.
Okay. Just a two-finger on the data. So I guess 2 points. One, I had similar concerns about the data quality. The only case I know anything about in detail and with regards to protests is Russia, and I've written about this. And I went back to our data from an article we published where we have data on thousands of protest events across the Russian regions by the opposition. And there's a really massive disjuncture between our data and the data that's been gathered by this project. I mean, look, in the 4-year time period we were looking at, the data that you all were using, it had about 100, it cataloged about 100 protests, but we have about 1,200. So 100 protests over 100, with over 100 protesters, and we have about 1,200. So I don't know what the nature of the bias is, if any, but I suspect there's undercounting in other cases as well. If there's not, I wonder why there's not undercounting. And a related point, or maybe it's not related, in my mind it's related though, but there's this whole literature on economies of scale and bureaucracies, which I think paradoxically might be related to your paper. And that literature finds that larger countries or larger units, they have smaller bureaucracies because there's economies of scale, right? So every country in the world has to have an ambassador to the United States. Every country in the world has to have a central banker, no matter how big it is, right? Mm-hmm. Well, there's a similar thing that goes on, I think, with journalism. Every tiny town in Russia or every administrative unit has its own daily newspapers. And what I think this might lead to is more newspaper coverage of events. And so I fear that what happens is in large decentralized countries, you end up with you end up with more of a spotlight. There's more journalists, there's more newspapers, so you have more of a spotlight on protest events than you would in say, Libya or something. That's just a conjecture, though. I have no proof of that.
No, yeah. Definitely, that's something to look at, yeah.
I mean, I could talk about the the data part of it all day. That's a totally different project, but some of that data is intended to be kind of a sampling of events that are occurring. It's a set coding scheme across all countries, and I think interestingly, when sometimes if we think some countries have a better developed kind of local news source or media, it doesn't seem to be driving how many we're getting compared to countries that we don't think have the same type of thing. And I know one of the kind of oddly thinking one of the countries that seems to have a high number of protests, given what we would think on the surface, is Namibia. They have lots of protests there, which is kind of, on the surface surprises you. Why Namibia? You don't hear anything about it, but there's lots of events. So it's a sampling of the events that occur. The difference in terms of just the number of protests maybe that in Russia from your data collection and from this one is might just be the sourcing of where we're collecting the information from, or where that project was collecting the information from that we're using the data from. And also, sorry, in terms of the protests that this data is including, they're only protests that are directed at the state institution, so at the government.
Yeah. Just quickly, I mean, just to say something good about your data, the larger protests seem to match up quite nicely, but it was smaller protests between 100 and 1,000 protesters. It seemed to me, just eyeballing it, to be a kind of random sample of the ones that actually took place. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that.
So maybe another way to do it is just to focus on the large protests, and that kind of you can dispense with these critiques by saying, well, these are agreed upon large protests that any credible data source would pick up. Right.
Right.
Okay. I've got Nils, and we'll go for about another 5 more minutes, and then we'll allow for a little bit of wrapping up.
Okay.
So, Nils.
So since we've talked about data, we've talked about theory, I've talked about framing, I just wanted to talk a little bit about the model itself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there are sort of two main points that I was wondering about. So you're estimating a zero-inflated model, but then you do not have the decentralization in the inflation stage, right? So whether or not you see sort of a protest is not sort of captured by that. And that sort of was surprising to me because, you know, if I believe your story that as an autocrat I want to have information about what's going on in the country, so I do want to have protest, but then I don't want to have so much of it, right? So I would expect, if your theory was true, that you should see a sort of a strong effect on whether or not you see protests at all, and then, you know, almost sort of a curvilinear relationship in the sense, you know, that you just sort of want to have sort of your ideal amount of protest. So that's one thing. The second point that I had about, so that I didn't understand about the empirics, was you have this interaction effect between the local or regional decentralization and polity, but then you don't have an interaction with polity square, which you are controlling for. And so I was wondering why you made that choice and why sort of you're not sort of looking at whether the sort of interaction effect with the polity is not actually sort of nonlinear, but has a sort of.
I guess just to clarify real quick, are you leaning towards suggesting like a three-way interaction term, or just interacting the decentralization with the polity square?
Square
like
is
two separate interactions, maybe.
Yeah, so two interactions, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't have a good answer for why we have not done that.
And actually, like, I mean, I think that in the first models we had in decentralization among like the variables in inflation states, and we took it out. But yeah, I mean, it's something that was there and for which we controlled, but it's not in the final model. So we should definitely put it back because I completely agree with you. I mean, it follows the theory. So.
Mm-hmm. That would make sense. Yeah, and I think it would make sense that if it is about autocrats getting information, they want it to be easier for protests to occur, but not to have this like exorbitant amount of protest. They don't want so much that it starts to interfere with what they're trying to do. It is about information, not an outlet for overthrow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you.
Do we have any final comments, any last-minute comments that discussants would like to make? Okay. Do you guys, the authors, would you like to respond with any kind of closing statement or wrap-up comments?
I mean, I just want to say thank you for all the comments. This is definitely very helpful, a lot to think about. It's also, a lot of these comments are also nice because they're reinforcing issues that we know we have, and we're trying to kind of wrap our minds around of how we should tackle these, which this has certainly helped with, and it's been beneficial from all your comments and recommendations. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was super helpful. Definitely. Yeah.
Well, excellent. I'd like to thank everybody for participating today, and the link to this this video will be posted on YouTube, so that anybody who would like to watch it afterward is welcome to do so. So you guys might look into the comments in case anybody makes something there that you would like to hear. And good luck with the paper.
Thank you, Emily.
All right, thanks everybody for participating, and we're going to shut down, and then we'll still be on the call.